Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September 14th edition of The Report. We were off last week for Labor Day, but we're back this week with a new episode. It's going to be quite a packed episode. We're going to have Jared with us along with Eric, and we're going to be discussing race ratings for all levels, including the House. And in addition to that, we're also going to be talking about the presidential debates and what impact they might have on the battleground. And then at the end, we might have a little debate discussion for a kind of impromptu debate time.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start talking about our ratings changes. So I guess we'll start with president real quick and do a quick rundown. So can you tell us about the presidential changes, Eric, and why you moved Nevada back to leans Democrat?
Yeah, so definitely. So Nevada is an interesting state, and I know Jerry could probably mention some stuff on the state later. There's reasons to be skeptical of Republican chances here. I would put this in the lower end of the leans tier. But what I've seen so far from polling indicates a close race. Both of the two polls we've gotten, including the most recent poll, have shown it within 5, which is about within our threshold for a competitive race. There's also reasons that, for example, the Reid machine is very well known in Nevada. They're very successful, but they've never really faced the sort of situation where they can't do the in-person voting like they're normally able to. The Reid machine is a very big deal in the Las Vegas area in getting out voters. And so that's a bit of an impact there as well. There's all sorts of reasons why we made the decision, but mainly we don't think it's in a separate tier at this point from Pennsylvania or from Wisconsin or from Michigan. These states we have in leans Democratic are all states we think Biden is favored in, and we think if the election were held today, he would win. If he wins all these states along with the safe states, he has the election. I think Nevada being in this tier is pretty fair, especially given what the standards we've been using so far. And I mean, obviously the poll from Siena is a good poll. It's an A+ pollster from 538. So it's polling isn't the only thing we consider in our ratings, as I'll explain in a little bit, but it is a factor that we do consider. So all things considered, I think this is a reasonable change. And I think it's probably one of the last changes we're going to be making toward the Republican Party for a while. I don't see, for example, any of the states that are in safe Democratic going towards Republicans at this point.
Mm-hmm. And out of the two states that are generally considered to be the best opportunities for Trump to win a Clinton state, do you think Nevada or Minnesota is more likely to flip if Trump were to flip one this election?
Now, that's an interesting one. I would actually put New Hampshire up there as well, mainly because New Hampshire is so unpredictable. It has a very elastic electorate. I think Nevada really would be out of the three. I'd actually put Nevada last, mainly because it's such a difficult state for Republicans at this point with the growth in Clark County. Jared and I explained this in the Map Room episode on Nevada. But there is significant problems in not only Clark County, but Washoe and other urban areas. Whereas in New Hampshire, it's extraordinarily swingy. You could imagine a scenario where Republicans win that. And even Minnesota, there's a lot of rural areas that are untapped and honestly a lot of suburban potential there, given some of the rioting stuff at this point. We really don't know how that's going to play out. I don't know if Jared wants to really add anything about Nevada, any insights, but out of our leans, I would actually probably put it last in terms of targets at the moment. I just don't think it's in a separate tier from the rest of these.
Jared, do you have any last minute comments about Nevada before we move on?
Definitely. So I do agree with that assertion. I think that New Hampshire and Minnesota are more tangible for Republicans than Nevada. I think as a native myself, growth in Clark County has been explosive. When Jackie Rosen won back in 2018, you saw a drastic shift in places like Summerlin and Henderson towards the Democratic column. And that's the momentum that I don't see changing really anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
But again, it's that turnout. It's the problem with the pandemic. We really don't know how this is going to impact some of the really crucial operations in Las Vegas. That is a part of this. All things considered, they've been able to win a lot of elections, and I wouldn't put it against them to win this time. But you never know in this sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. Our presidential map right now has a ton of states in the battleground column. And that when we say battleground column, we basically mean anything that's rated as technically likely through toss-up for either party. That's quite a lot of states. I mean, if you look at our toss-up states, just pure toss-ups, theoretically enough to move the election in either direction if one candidate was able to win most of those toss-up states, plus an additional state that we have rated in a leans column. But I think we've exhausted the amount of time we can spend on president this week because we don't have that many important changes that we made to the presidential race. And we'll be talking about the presidential race later in the show. So I think what we should do now is move on to the Senate, where we had one change, and that was in Michigan, where we moved that race back to leans Democratic from likely Democratic. And I know that Kraz was the initial proponent of that, and he's with Adam Trencher in charge of the Senate ratings team there. So I don't know what you guys think about that. Could you just give us your thoughts? I mean, Gary Peters has definitely been the commanding favorite if you look at polling over John James this time around. But I know the Republicans are just going to say that, well, Debbie Stabenow was leading by double digits. Sherrod Brown was leading by double digits, and they only won by single digits on election day. So does that give James a chance? Really, I just don't see James having any chance at all unless Trump carries Michigan, which is looking pretty unlikely at this point, given the fact that the Trump campaign has effectively pulled all their advertising spending out of Michigan and is now targeting states that are, in its mind, better targets like North Carolina, Florida, Wisconsin, etc. But I just want to hear both of your opinions on that change and what you think it means for the Senate race.
So I guess I'll go first here. I do agree with this change. Mainly, it's putting it in line with where the Senate race is. The question is if the Senate race is another tier from the presidential race, and I think most people would be of the firm mind if Trump wins Michigan, John James probably is carried along or does similarly. Their fates kind of seem pretty similar, and if you look at the average polling at the moment, Biden's leading in recent polls by decent margins, and Peters is leading by decent margins, but they're not that different at this point. Whereas before, when we had the race at Likely, the polling had been different. Trump had been closer by a decent margin than James was. So that's just the reason we had for that.
And Jared, what do you think?
I also think that it was a good decision. I think that when you look at the polling, it has conveyed a very clear message, and that is that Trump is not polling too far either behind or ahead of James, and so they're pretty comparable candidates in terms of their appeal in Michigan. It was conjectured that maybe James would have some more appeal in places like Oakland County, which is more suburban, but we've seen a few instances that have gone against that. In fact, there was a mayor of a city in Macomb County, one that is pretty suburban in nature, that notably voted for him in 2018, but is now voting for Gary Peters. And so that's an interesting case. But I don't think that there's any demonstrable lead that Trump has over James. And so I think having them both as sort of leans Democratic is a really good choice.
It's worth noting, of course, that Peters' home base is in Oakland County, which is a large suburban county. So that is an advantage for him. Although obviously James did a little bit better in places like Wayne County, not by an astronomical margin, but he did a little bit better there than you'd expect a Republican to. So there's a lot. Basically, I think they're too similar. I think Trump is more likely to carry the state than James, but they're not in different tiers of winnability, basically.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting, not just for Michigan, but just for states in general. One of the more fascinating things is looking at how the Senate versus the presidential vote turns out. How much of an undervote is there going to be in some of these Senate races, and how will Senate candidates outrun presidential candidates? Some states, like Montana, for example, we know Bullock's going to outrun Joe Biden by a significant amount, but other states it's less easy to ascertain initially. It's going to be interesting because one thing that another analyst that I really like on here is Jackson Bryan, and he's really a true rising star, but he's brought this up before, and he's said, well, this election will be pretty boring if the Senate races all line up perfectly with the presidential race like they did in 2016. Not exact percentage-wise, but in terms of actual outcome. So the question is, will we see any splitting between the Senate and the presidential results this cycle? And I think that's interesting when we're looking at Michigan. I don't think Michigan's a good example of it because I think if you look at the polls right now, Biden is still a decisive favorite there. And same with Gary Peters. So yeah, I would say again we should move on from our discussion of Michigan, but I think you guys provided some very insightful points. And even if we don't apply the points you brought up to Michigan, we can apply them to other states where we have competitive races for president and for the U.S. Senate. So I guess now we can move on to House, which has garnered a lot of controversy. And I just want to start by saying that if anyone disagrees, I respect your opinion and I'm willing to talk to you about it. I really just come on Twitter to just be benevolent. I don't want to make anyone mad. So I guess we'll talk about those. We had 10 ratings changes today, moved some races towards the Republicans and some towards the Democrats. I think some of our more notable changes, obviously the most controversial one, Oklahoma 5 moved to lean R. Eric has a ton of evidence that he and Kraz worked on earlier, and he's going to discuss it here for you to add on to what I wrote earlier and kind of heighten what we decided would be our analysis for this rating change. And well, quite frankly, we're going to discuss the other ratings changes too, because we had some big moves in seats like South Carolina 1, where we moved the seat to leans Democrat, proclaiming Joe Cunningham a favorite, and in California 25, where we now consider Mike Garcia a favorite as well there. So I guess we'll start off just by talking about Oklahoma 5, if you want to introduce your evidence, because I know that's what everyone else wants to hear. So we're not going to bounce around the bush. We'll have you just get right into what people want to hear.
Yeah, so sure. So one thing to point out, I would think, is that we're not a polling aggregator. We're a news website, and we have our own sources and our own evidence and our own statistics that we've looked at for making our decisions. So when we look at polling, that's just one factor. We're not blindly adjusting our ratings based on a poll, a single poll, or multiple polls, and we're not doing it based off of just what another polling aggregator or news website does. So when we're making these changes, we consider a lot of different things. And for a while on the website, if you've read our articles and listened to some of the podcasts, we've discussed how Kendra Horn is really one of the more vulnerable House Democrats. It's not just because her district voted for Trump by around 13 percentage points. He won at 53 to 40. That's a pretty good advantage for him. It's not as good as in the Senate race, but if you look at the gubernatorial race, you'll find that in fact that Kendra Horn ran well behind Drew Edmondson. Drew Edmondson won his district by 11 percentage points, 10 percentage points, somewhere around that margin, a solid margin. Horn won the district by 2 percentage points. Well, to put it bluntly,
actually less than that.
Yeah. To put it bluntly, she's going to need to outrun Trump to win this district, because Trump is most likely going to win Oklahoma 5. There's not been a lot of polling to suggest otherwise, and a 13-point swing would be indicative of national trends that would really just be completely, kind of unforeseen and really major. So she's going to need to win over voters that vote for President Trump. Given the fact she ran so far behind Drew Edmondson, who easily carried this district in the gubernatorial race, that is one really compelling piece of information that we've been hammering in for a while now as to why we actually consider this a better target for Republicans than South Carolina 1, which, for the same reason, Joe Cunningham actually outran the gubernatorial candidate in South Carolina when he won that district. We moved that to leans Democratic. It's the exact same logic being used there. There are other reasons in this district as well. For one thing, we know for a fact that there's not been a lot of internal polling. I've seen people argue that Republicans aren't releasing polls. From what I've heard, that's because they don't exist. At least not to the degree that people are really acting like that. They're polls that have been withheld and because Republicans are not confident about their chances. But again, we're not going off of just one source or one piece of information. One other thing is just when looking at candidate quality, Joe Cunningham, as a comparison here, campaigned in a difficult district on an issue, offshore drilling, that is very important to that district. That's actually the reason why he won in all likelihood, was offshore drilling. Oklahoma 5, Kendra Horn probably won because of education. The problem is that that's a state level issue, and she kind of rode the coattails of Drew Edmondson to winning that district, but you can't really go after Stephanie Bice for education. She actually voted for a tax increase to increase teacher pay. Just from a fundamental level, there's really not a whole lot we're looking at that shows she's someone who can break away from the pack, someone who's going to run ahead of Trump by a good enough margin to win a district that's historically been Republican. There's just a lot of reasons we went into this decision. And again, also, we're culling our toss-up ratings. We had a lot of toss-up ratings, and we're slowly getting rid of them as we near the election. I think we're at 50 days until the election. So this is the time where you start getting rid of some of those. And as a result, some of the calls are going to seem a little bit difficult. We don't have tilt ratings. We use leans. This is the closest rating to a toss-up. This doesn't mean the race isn't competitive. It doesn't mean the rating could change later if there's been other indications. We know that Kendra Horn has a cash on hand advantage, although it's not because of a lack of fundraising on Stephanie Bice's part. It's because of amount of spending had to be done in the primary. We know that Democrats are pretty confident about her internal polling. That's a factor we considered. But when we weigh it with the statistical evidence that we've looked at when we've examined the seat, we think that Stephanie Bice is the favorite here. And she's one of only two Republicans we have is favored to take over a seat at the moment. The other is in the 7th district of Minnesota is Michelle Fischbach. So it's a small group. And in elections, typically, even in wave elections, you'll have a couple of candidates who go against the national wave. In 2008, you had a couple of Democratic incumbents lose the race. Nancy Boyda in Kansas. You had
Mahoney.
Mahoney in Pennsylvania.
And then in 2010, you had the cow in Louisiana lose.
Yeah,
after beating Bill Jefferson in 2008.
Yep. In 2014, you had Gwen Graham and Brad Ashford win 2 districts in a very, very red wave. So just because a district is competitive doesn't mean all competitive districts are going to trend towards one party in the event of a wave election, which, to be clear, we're not even sure this is a wave election. So there's a lot of reasons we made this decision. I don't want to stay on this too long, but I wanted to give you kind of an in-depth overview into how we do our ratings and what we've considered here.
Yeah, and this was something that was agreed to by quite a few people on the staff team. Eric, Kraz, all backed it up and agreed with it. We don't do our ratings just based off of whims and decisions. Like, we have actual evidence that we've used to back it up. And I know that we've received criticism, essentially criticizing the ratings. And I don't really know what to say otherwise than criticism is fine. I don't mind that. But we just want to use this as a medium to express why we did. And I did want to say something earlier that needed to be said when we brought up Kyle in Louisiana, an example of a representative like that, one in a special case. And that was mentioned in the comments. It's true. Bill Jefferson was mired in corruption in what should have been a safe Democratic seat. And I did want to say that long-term, Oklahoma County and the 5th as a whole are continuing to move favorably for the Democrats. And that is something that we are still willing to admit. But there is still, on the most basic level, looking at the district, a Republican lean.
And I do want to make more comment here, which is someone in the comments that there's been Republican polling showing Biden up. I can confirm that does not exist. That poll does not exist. Again, if what I'm hearing is from what I know and from the individuals and the organizations that I know, Republicans were not polling this race during the primary. They were polling the primary. This is an expensive race to go over. This isn't so. Just because you see something on Twitter from an anonymous user doesn't mean it's real. Whereas, again, we're a news organization. We're a relatively new news organization, but we consider ourselves to be fairly professional, and we do our due diligence and research. So I just wanted to clear the air on that because I've seen that misconception go around, and I've discussed this before on Twitter, mainly just because, again, from what I know, that person is either wrong or doesn't know what they're talking about, to be blunt.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've exhausted the topping point on this because at the end of the day, we'll have the November election. We'll know who's right or wrong. And there's always room for error, especially on one seat. I mean, just look at Kansas 2 back in 2018. Or, in fact, South Carolina 1 and Oklahoma 5. I know it's the reverse, but no one expected that either. So it's just going to be waiting it out and seeing what's happening. But again, from our organizational standpoint, this is something we agreed on and had evidence for. And quite honestly, if you disagree with it, you can express your opinion on that, and that's fine. So
yeah, we appreciate all the engagement. We've gotten a lot of good discussion, I think, from this. And I think it's important that organizations kind of encourage that discussion and not just kind of go off of what other one's doing. I'm not saying anyone else does that, and I don't think anyone else does that, but I want to be clear that that's not what we do. Just another organization has ratings one way. We're not going to just be blindly copying off of what they do or blindly copying what off the polls do. Ultimately, we are our own organization, and we do our own research.
And there's no evidence either that internal polls should be trusted either way. Quite frankly, internal polls are by default bad. I mean, they're not high quality.
Yeah, I want to see if Jared wanted to throw anything in here because, or if he had any thoughts on this race before we go over some of the other House races that we had to discuss.
Yeah, so I agree with the ratings change. I think I want to put out there that I wholeheartedly agree with the system that we're using, where we're trying to refrain from having toss-ups by the November election. And it is something that's daring. Various other sources have not done something like this, but I think it's something that's important because in all these races, a victor is going to emerge. And I think that what we have been seeing in Oklahoma County is that in the long term, it is a county that is trending to the left. relative to the state, it had started to vote to the left quite recently. And it is one that I think will be very close to the presidential level. I think there's a possibility that Trump ekes out a win in the county, but I'm not going to throw everything out there right now because there is room to change. But Stephanie Bice, I do think she's a strong candidate, and Kendra Horn has not established herself with as much of a distinct reputation as Joe Cunningham, say, has, or Jared Golden has in Maine and South Carolina. And so I think it's hard to say that she is necessarily the favorite. I think Stephanie Bice is just a good candidate.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen good candidates in general in House elections this year not necessarily end up being favorites to win. Another race that we did change today was the 1st District in Iowa, where we moved Congresswoman Abby Finkenauer's race to lean Democrat. And Ashley Hinson is still a good candidate. But again, you're seeing around the whole country, Republican challengers are still trailing their Democratic incumbents. And while that is normal usually for a challenger to trail an incumbent, I know there are plenty of exceptions from the 2018 cycle. In this case, it doesn't necessarily make them a bad candidate just because they're down in fundraising. And fundraising is something we've mentioned repeatedly in our analysis, but it's important to remember as well that fundraising doesn't equal votes necessarily. And that's just something that's important to remember. Like the 7th congressional district race here in New Jersey is arguably a toss-up or lean Democratic as we have it rated. If you looked at fundraising, Malinowski would be a pretty clear favorite. Yet still, Keene is receiving outside money, and Kane's using that money to run attack ads against Malinowski. So just because one candidate's organization may be trailing an incumbent in a race doesn't necessarily mean they're incapable of running a feasible or strong campaign against the incumbent they're running against. Because if you're getting money from outside organizations, it supplements that. That's another thing we've talked about with Oklahoma 5, and I know the Republicans are going to do this in South Carolina 1 as well, because the DCCC just did a new ad buy series for Joe Cunningham a few days ago. Yeah.
And one other thing I wanted to mention is that our ratings aren't final. We update them every other week. We update the governor ratings every month, but we update the ratings every other week, and we consider new evidence. So if evidence changes, we can and have moved races that we previously shifted. I know a while back we had moved Pennsylvania's 1st district from leans to likely, but we saw pretty compelling evidence shortly afterward that the race was closer than indicated, and we moved it back. So if more evidence comes out and suggests that we're wrong here, we'll change the rating. There's a lot of time until election day, but we wanted to start trimming some of these toss-up ratings because we have a lot of them. And really, if we feel like we need to give kind of, I guess, a clear stance on where we think these races lie. We don't use tilts, we use lean. And so just, again, keep that in mind overall.
Yeah, and before we move on, I guess we'll just go through some of the other changes we had. I know people are now probably going to brand us for one change as some right-wing hack organization, but we actually are pretty fair, and I would consider our ratings pretty balanced, in my personal opinion. I mean, we just moved Maine 2 and South Carolina 1 to the Democrats. They're now both leans Democratic, and we had compelling evidence there as well. Jared Golden is a strong incumbent. He's a good candidate. And Dale Crafts is also a very good candidate. But unfortunately for Dale Crafts, he's being held back by the fact that he has almost no money. And when I say no money, it's not like, for example, Oklahoma 5, where Bice is trailing Horn, but still has enough cash on hand to run a feasible campaign. We're talking about Dale Crafts has about, I think, $38,000 of cash on hand, which is really quite small, even with national Republican money being dumped into this district. But we moved that. I talked about in the article how Jared Golden kind of perfectly fits the traditional moderate Democrat image that's associated with Maine's 2nd district there. Mike Michoud, before he ran for governor, is a good example of that. Another conservative, or you could say moderate Democrat. And Jared Golden, he does have a moderate record. If you look at his record, he's rated as a centrist by GovTrack. He's voted against part of the impeachment against Donald Trump, and he voted against Pelosi's bid for the speakership, or at least held that promise. Now, whether or not voters believe his record or stick to the inevitable Republican attack ads that, and this goes for both parties tend to misrepresent an incumbent's record in an effort to defeat them. But we personally believe that Golden is an appealing enough candidate, kind of in the same way as Cunningham, young and enthusiastic, to merit a leans Democratic rating. And I guess just going on before I throw it to you guys, talking about Cunningham, he did outrun Smith in his bid for governor in 2018 when Cunningham was running for Congress. He did outrun the top of the ticket that year. From what we've looked at, and we've compared this to Kraz's article, but that most recent special election, and I wanted to mention this as well because the crystal ball actually referenced this too. The special election for the legislative seat in the Charleston area, the Democrats won by double digits, and we generally are using that as evidence that the Charleston area and the coastal suburbs and coastal regions along South Carolina are trending Democratic at a faster rate than Oklahoma City and its suburbs. And we don't have any proof of that yet, but I guess we will after the 2020 election, but it's kind of a hypothesis that we have right now. But Cunningham, again, a lot like Golden to an even greater extent, his low country values campaign is actually quite poignant. He does have a very well-established brand, and that should help in garnering crossover appeal. And if, let's say, Trump wins both this district and Oklahoma 5, if he wins this by less, and you've already got an incumbent like Cunningham who has greater appeal than Horn and more crossover more crossover appeal, then that just benefits him for re-election. And I know the crystal ball talked about this too, and we always plugged them, but we actually had very similar reasoning looking at South Carolina 1 and moving it. And while there is a possibility for it to change back, because Nancy Mace is still a good candidate, reminds me a lot of Stephanie Bice, actually. Even though there's a possibility it'll change back, we still at this moment consider incumbents like Golden, Finkenauer, and Cunningham as lean Democratic now. Those were all previously toss-ups, and they kind of follow up to our change last week in New Mexico where we had Xochitl Torres Small, who's in a rematch there against Yvette Harrell. Her seat moved as well, who leans Democratic. So we're going to be thinning out the toss-up column, and that's just something that's going to happen as we move to Election Day.
Mm-hmm. And personally, I do think Nancy Mace is a good candidate and has a good opportunity to win that seat back. But if you were to ask out of the two, Cunningham clearly has the far better reputation. He actually has a major policy one with the offshore drilling. Obviously, Nancy Mace has opposed that as well. But the offshore drilling ban came while Cal Cunningham was in office. Or not Cal Cunningham, Joe Cunningham, sorry. The two they're both basically generic white guys. I mean, I'm basically a generic white guy, so I mean, can't really judge. But overall, I think, we used the exact same logic in switching this race as we did for Oklahoma 5. We used for Iowa 1st Congressional District. So again, I mean, as evidence comes in, we'll reconsider these ratings every other week as we do, and we discuss these ratings internally as well. So personally, I think these are all justifiable. I know J. Miles Coleman on Twitter said that they're all reasonable rating changes. There's obviously room for debate on some of them, and debate is a good thing. But again, that's just kind of where I'm looking at this from. I do agree out of the two, Stephanie Bice does have the far better chance of winning, oddly enough, given, she didn't even win her primary. She had to go to a runoff. She finished second in the original primary, had to go to a runoff. We initially thought Nancy Mace would actually have a better chance because she outright won her primary. She didn't have to go to a runoff. She was able to campaign immediately. But again, that's how things go. Sometimes they go a little bit differently than you'd expect at first.
And we're going to get races wrong. I guarantee you right now, every forecaster right now, major or minor, is going to get multiple races wrong, especially for the House, because it is impossible to predict every House race accurately. And anyone that wants to pontificate on how an outcome to a competitive House race like Oklahoma 5 is going to be as if it were a definite fact set in stone 50 days from the election may be in for a rude awakening. That's all I have to say, because at least even though we've tried to defend our rating, we never say something set in stone. And I think it's just something worth looking at as we go forward. It's still possible Kendra Horn wins re-election. If it happens, then we'll just accept we were wrong. But I feel like if the other outcome turns out and Bice wins, I don't feel like the people, at least some of the people pushing the theory that Horn is definitely a clear favorite right now, rather than it being a draw or lean to Bice, they might also not take it very well if she ended up losing. Right. But I don't know, Jared, if you have anything else to say before we move on to our
Yes. So two notes on Maine 2nd District, which I think it was fair to move it to the lean Dem column. It's understood that Trump won the district by 10 points in 2016. However, when you look at the actual vote totals, he only garnered 51% of the vote. The reason why he won by such a huge margin is because Hillary Clinton only got 41% of the vote. And as you may know, Maine recently implemented a system of ranked choice voting, and that could have, if that had been in place during that election, that could have incredibly skewed the results in Hillary Clinton's favor. In fact, it's possible that Trump could have won the district 53 to 47, let's just say, if ranked choice voting hadn't been implemented then, or if he did not get 50% of the vote. We saw in 2018, we saw Bruce Poliquin initially lead with the results, but as ranked choice voting was implemented, we saw Jared Golden pull ahead and eventually secure a majority to win. And so that's a factor. The second thing I want to mention is that Biden has noteworthy and considerable strength among seniors around the country. And Maine 2nd District is no different. And so I could feasibly see an outcome where Trump only manages to win the 2nd District by low single digits. And given Maine's elasticity, given the fact that Susan Collins is probably going to be pulling ahead and there's going to be some ticket splitting in the state, I could absolutely conceivably see Jared Golden be able to pull out a win, even given that circumstance.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with Cunningham. Both of them have either proven or are likely to prove that they can outrun the top of the ticket or garner ticket splitting. Mm-hmm. That's something that Kendra Horn hasn't done yet.
One other thing I wanted to mention with South Carolina that they did probably factor into our rating is that House district race. It was a couple weeks back, there was a race in a state House district in South Carolina. It was projected to be a competitive district. I believe C-Analysis had it as a toss-up going into the night. The Democrat ended up winning this competitive House district with around 58 to 59% of the vote. This is right in the core of Charleston. This is a key area, and the margins matched about what Joe Cunningham was able to get last time. So again, it's a state legislative race. It's not a general race. It was a special election. But again, that's something we considered here. If we had evidence like that in Oklahoma, that would factor into our decision. But we do factor into things more than just what polls say or what consultants say or what people say. We look at this from our own perspective.
Yeah. And I think we're going to move on now away from the ratings and move on to our next section, which is basically talking about the presidential debates. And I wanted to tie them in to the presidential battleground by talking a little bit about historically how debates have influenced presidential elections and how much they stick in voters' minds when you actually get to the election day a few weeks after the debates. So as you guys may know already, there are going to be a total of 4 debates this cycle, 1 VP debate and 3 presidential debates. The first one is September 29th, which is an upcoming Tuesday, and it's going to be in Cleveland, moderated by Chris Wallace. Both are participating, both candidates. And after that, you're going to have one on October 15th in Miami, moderated by Steve Scully, and then one on the 22nd of October in Nashville, moderated by Kristen Welker. And finally, you're going to have a debate in Salt Lake City, Utah, moderated by Susan Page, between the 2 vice presidential candidates, Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris. So first off, what do you guys think about the debates? And what do you think about that schedule, the moderators? Do you guys have anything that sticks out in your minds when we look at this at first?
I think the choice of the moderators is pretty good. I like the choices that they had. I think Chris Wallace is really an inspired choice for a moderator. He's known as kind of a hard-hitting guy. He doesn't take sides. He doesn't. He's pretty equal to everyone in terms of how he treats it, and he's generally well respected for his work at Fox News. So I think that was a very good choice for a moderator from that perspective. I think that's going to be a very interesting debate, and it's going to be the very first one. So I'm really excited to see how that one in particular goes.
Yeah, and the second debate's moderated by Steve Scully, who is he's a major contributor at C-SPAN, actually, which is, as you know, a nonpartisan government entity. So again, on the objectivity scale, that's another good example of someone who would probably be a good debate moderator. I mean, Chris Wallace has also proven to be a good debate moderator, someone who's fairly objective. And we'll get to know the other moderators as well, because I don't know all of them in depth, but I think it's interesting to look at. And, there are times where we've seen an incumbent president come into a first debate and get a bit roughed up by the challenger, kind of surprised. Mitt Romney against Obama. I know President Obama's first debate of his reelection campaign in 2012 got roughed up a little bit, ended up coming back in the other debates and doing well. So do you think we could see something similar with President Trump, or do you buy into the theory, as President Trump has repeatedly espoused, that Joe Biden is mentally incapable of debating? Because I know that that's something that's very popular among online right circles right now. Whereas Democrats believe Joe Biden can debate fine, considering he's been proven himself to be an extremely competent and capable debater already in the Democratic primary debates, which arguably are more chaotic.
I think that Trump is espousing this theory that it is going to be sort of self-inflicted at some point. What I mean by that is that when he asserts that Joe Biden is not going to be a good debater, I think he sets the bar so low that if Joe Biden in some way clears it, then Joe Biden is exceeding expectations and it reflects well upon him. And this is a point that's been brought up on many people across Twitter and other platforms. And so I think it's a very salient point. But Trump needs to be careful because Trump has had many flubs throughout his own career, and he's had many imperfect moments, especially while debating. I think another factor, and this is a bit tangential, but I think that given the coronavirus pandemic and the changes that have ensued as a result, because there's not going to be that huge bombastic live audience that appears at the debates, I think that's going to cause essentially a depravity of the sensationalism that we so often see and appreciate during those debates. And Trump, as we know, with his large raucous rallies, he recently had one in Henderson, which is 20 minutes away from where I live. That is something that is going to hinder Trump's abilities, I believe, and stifle him from really exerting his full potential. And I think that Biden being more pragmatic and being more policy driven is really going to benefit from that. And he's going to have more of an opportunity, and he's going to have more faculty to be able to make his points in a way that does not try to stoke any ire of conservatives or try to conjure up any sort of sensationalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I think Trump made a very big strategic blunder here by deciding to not pitch Biden as a subpar debater, but an incompetent debater, so thoroughly inept and incapable of engaging in rational conversation that simply stringing together a complete sentence would, basically just defeats the entire argument. Like, if he wanted to go after Biden for being a subpar debater, he could absolutely do that. Biden didn't blow anyone's socks off in the vice presidential debate in 2008. Palin held her own in that debate. One of the few good moments she had in her vice presidency since she started, or vice presidential candidacy since she started. I don't think anyone in particular remembers him, his 2012 debate against Paul Ryan as being particularly impressive. And frankly, his Democratic debates were fine, but they weren't, there weren't a whole lot of just shocking debate wins, right? So if he wanted to say, he's not a good debater, we're excited to expose his lies or whatever, if that's what they wanted to word it, they could have done that. But they have set the bar so low that it's really hard to picture a scenario where Biden doesn't come off at least as competent, which defeats a key message of the campaign, which is that he's incompetent. I don't know why they decided to go into that approach. If there's one thing he's known for in debating, it's that he's generally fairly competent. He's not a home run hitter. He's not going to get you a whole lot of moments, but he's not going to be, he's not going to be making strategic blunders a whole lot. Like he sometimes has off the cuff stuff, but in these sorts of debates, he does fine. So unless there's some sort of last minute change and he really has had some sort of issues, I wouldn't think that this is the best approach the Trump administration could have taken in setting up their strategy. Whereas previously his debate strategy was actually pretty good. He was very aggressive against Hillary Clinton in the 3 debates. He was able to kind of vaporize a lot of his own sexual assault issues by bringing the accusers of Bill Clinton. That really stole a lot of attention. Whether or not it was a classy move or not, it stole attention. He was pretty good in those. He generally had a handle of what he was doing. So I'm really not sure what the change was here. But again, we're just going off hypotheticals here. We don't know what his debate strategy actually is. Once he's on stage, he could change what he's doing or do something unexpected.
Right. I want to quickly allude to a comment that somebody made, which is that this might essentially be reminiscent of the 1960 debates. Now, for any of our viewers who are not familiar, the 1960 debates were essentially the first televised debates between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. They lacked any sort of audience, and so it was very matter-of-fact, policy-driven. And sort of the legend there is that if you actually heard the debate on the radio, you would have thought that Nixon had won. But if you look at the spectacle, if you look at how Nixon was getting sweaty and hot under the lights, you thought that Kennedy looked more composed and polished and that he had actually won the debates. And I think that with Biden's blunders, and he does have a stutter, and so and that might be something that does affect the way that he actually conveys his messaging. But I think that when you actually resort to the visual aspect of it, when you look at the way that Biden composes himself, I think people have made comments that Biden Biden, for example, is very composed, very polished, very well dressed, and I think that those are things that are going to come across to viewers, perhaps even more so than some of the other factors that might arise during the debate.
Mm-hmm. And frankly, if Trump chooses to go after his stutter, that would be a strategic blunder. I would think that would just be beyond the pale. Personally, I know we don't go into personal too much, but I think he would face severe criticism for taking that on a debate.
I mean, he's already faced
yeah.
extreme criticism for when he mocked a reporter at the end of the 2016 campaign,
Yeah,
and that would be even worse.
Yeah,
but I wanted to mention
if
something real quick. Basically, someone in the comments said, would he mention Tara Reid, he being Trump? And I would say no, because then Biden could just turn around and start talking about all the sexual assault allegations against Trump. And I'm sure that's something both of their campaigns have been training them on going into these debates, because with the raucousness of Trump and someone fighting against Trump, it's going to lead to something that's uncouth or off the cuff. There's no way the debate stays entirely deformed, because quite frankly, that's just not President Trump's style, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It really just opened a whole can of worms that I don't think either campaign wants to delve into.
Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, this is probably going to be a debate more substantively on the issues than the 2016 debates, I would think, however minimal, because I think the focus is primarily going to be on stuff like COVID-19. It's going to be on foreign policy issues like China. They're probably going to mention at some point the Cuties film, try to tie that into, however unfairly, I would almost certainly think he's going to mention that. Like, there's a lot of stuff you can go after. Tara Reid, he could go after, but it's pretty low on the list because, again, Trump is generally, last time he was fairly competent in his strategy, and I think he would realize that this would just be a bad approach for him to take overall.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with Jared on that. Did people freeze up here?
Any on the general election, and you can use some historical evidence for this, but
mm-hmm.
Do you guys have anything to say about that?
You kind of froze up. I couldn't hear what you said.
I'm repeating that.
Okay, so basically I was saying, my computer was frozen. I was saying, based on historical precedent, looking at past presidential campaigns, how will the debates, regardless of which way they end up going, towards Biden or Trump, impact the general election? How much will they impact voters' decisions, as ballots are actually already being mailed out in many states? And for those who are voting on Election Day or closer to Election Day, will the debates even be in their minds by the time they actually cast their votes?
That's an interesting question. I think, and this sort of echoes something that I mentioned earlier, but there's not going to be a lot of room for those zingers that absolutely pull one campaign ahead. I mean, 1984, Ronald Reagan was pulling ahead already, but when he made that comment in response to Walter Mondale judging or questioning his judgment as a result of his age, that really just solidified his winning capacity.
And that ended he admitted, he said to his wife, and this is a true story, but he said to his wife that he knew on that night that the campaign was over and he had no chance of winning on that night. Prior to that, he thought he could still win, even despite his polling deficit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, this isn't like 1984, where we don't expect the incumbent to win the popular vote by that much or the electoral vote. But given our polarization, the debate will definitely be more raucous than past debates, especially debates like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, if you look back even historically, I think the last few cycles, they haven't made a huge difference in terms of where things were. The 2008 debates, Obama had a marginal advantage in all three, if I recall right, but it wasn't overwhelming. It certainly, and McCain did come off as bad. It was mainly that Obama came off as fairly good. 2012, obviously, you had some gaffes. You had the infamous Candy Crowley moment, which he later apologized for, that potentially caused some issues for Romney in the long term in terms of being directly refuted by a debate moderator during a debate. But beyond that, I don't think anyone remembers any of those debates as spectacular on either side. 2016, it was those big moments. It was specifically the one thing I keep going back to is that I remember. The only thing I really remember about them is the bringing of the Clinton sexual assault accusers there. That was a moment that stuck out. I can't think of something that Trump would do that would have that sort of at least staying power, at least whether good or bad, right?
Especially when you've got a debate with no audience.
Yeah, there's no audience. There's no live thing to go off of. It's ultimately going to be a fairly cold experience. And so not having that energy could actually impact Trump, right? I mean, he kind of feeds off of the crowd. The question is if that's a good thing or a bad thing. If not having the crowd there to kind of encourage his worst impulses might actually prevent, from doubling down on some issues. I mean, who knows?
And if we want to talk about the VP debates real quick, the VP is often neglected unless you're a true political junkie like us who actually enjoy looking at the history of vice presidential selections and their impact on elections, which is usually pretty low unless you've got occasional home state advantages for a native son VP candidate. But in general, the VP does not decide how most Americans vote. But VP debates have had interesting moments. Like you said earlier, Sarah Palin did, handle her own against Joe Biden in a debate that arguably Joe Biden should have walked away with, given Sarah Palin's poor performance as the VP pick in 2008 in general. Didn't bring very much to the ticket other than unifying and rallying the support of the more conservative wings of the GOP that were hesitant to back John McCain at first. Yeah. But you also have those classic moments like Lloyd Bentsen in 1988 telling Dan Quayle, no Jack Kennedy. Quite embarrassing. You don't know if any of those things are going to randomly come out or happen during a debate. And back in 2016 even, Mike Pence, whatever you think about him, is very calm as a man. He has a very relaxed disposition, and he uses it to debate pretty effectively. And Tim Kaine is not a person who's rude or agitated. He's actually, from what I've heard from people who've met him, like Miles Coleman, a very nice, friendly guy. But Tim Kaine came off as very frustrated and agitated in that debate, and it generated a clear winner in Mike Pence simply because he kept his cool the whole time and failed to acquiesce to Tim Kaine's attacks on him, I guess you could say. So I'm curious to see if Kamala Harris tries and takes the same strategy that he took, which is more aggressive attacks against Pence, and whether Pence, since unlike Trump, Pence actually can keep himself composed, and how that will impact the VP debate. What do you guys think about that real quick before we move on?
I definitely do. I definitely do think that Mike Pence is going to spend most of his time on the defense, whereas Kamala Harris is going to be attacking him on several points. But as you mentioned, Harrison, his disposition is very mild-mannered and very calm. And so I think he'll be able to weather through it. I mean, to what extent, I'm not really sure. But Kamala Harris and Mike Pence are both very confident debaters. And I think that they all have different approaches, different styles. But I think they'll both, within their own rights, hold their own.
Yeah, I would be willing to bet that might actually be a more interesting debate, the VP debate, because both of those candidates, I mean, let's face it, both of those candidates, there's a strong likelihood that both of them end up running for president at some point, potentially. It's possible. Yeah. Mike Pence could run for president. I don't know how likely it is, and whether or not he would win is questionable, but he could run. So it is possible that this could be at least some kind of a preview of certain candidates that could make bids for the highest office eventually.
Yeah, I think in particular, I think this is actually an opportunity for Pence. Obviously, he was able to handle someone who came off a little bit too aggressive. If there's one thing we know from Kamala Harris from her previous debates is that it wasn't impressive enough to secure her the nomination. In fact, if anything, her debate performances hurt her, specifically having to backtrack on some issues, being inconsistent on topics like Medicare for all, having to basically have to do the dual image of trying to present herself as a moderate and as a progressive at the same time. I think this could be a challenge for her and a genuine opportunity for Pence, especially to try and convince some more, Trump skeptical suburban voters, because whether or not you agree with Pence on social issues, he's generally more representative of what the conservative movement used to be than Donald Trump is, and it is an opportunity to present a better light for those sorts of voters. So I think there's an opportunity there, but there's also a lot Kamala could attack him on. Specifically, I know for a fact I think she's going to target him aggressively on LGBT issues, and I mean that would be kind of a no-brainer in terms of that aspect, and that could be I could help with suburban voters.
Yeah, I could see that as well. But at the same time, I mean, this is not my personal opinion here, but there are a lot of voters, especially voters who either swung to Trump from the working class, who could be swayed by Mike Pence, even if he doesn't fully state the record accurately. If he talks about economic issues or things that Trump promised, even if Trump didn't accomplish them, all Pence would really have to say to certain people watching the debate is that this happened, and they might believe him, because those particular voters may not care as much about LGBT rights as they would, example, an economic issue, if you're looking at certain types of voters. Now, I'm not talking about suburban voters. I'm talking about more what some are saying is becoming the new base of the Republican Party, at least on the presidential level. But
Mhm.
there were still a ton of suburban districts that went to Trump in 2016. So we're going to have to wait till after 2020 before we make any actual judgment about whether the trends we saw in 2018 are going to continue. And currently, the evidence we've seen show that they likely will, but we're still going to have to wait and see. So I guess now we can talk about or switch into our last debate topic. And this is actually the real debate. I don't know if we can just do a discussion, but basically it was going to be, should Medicare for all be implemented, and how should we address our nation's healthcare system? And it's very broad, but I guess we can just throw it around and talk about our ideas for healthcare in the United States and how it should be conducted.
Hmm. So I guess I'll kind of go first here. Specifically on the issue, I'm kind of a cynic of the ability of the government to be able to not only to enact a positive change, but one that the citizenry will accept. I think if the last few decades have shown anything, it's that anytime you touch healthcare in any manner, aside from maybe expanding it a little bit, like Medicare Part D, that it's a disastrous move. Obviously, you had the 1990s healthcare reform attempt by Bill Clinton, was partially responsible for the red wave. You had Obamacare in 2009, which was responsible for losing a Senate seat in Massachusetts and ultimately losing the House majority, a majority that was by all means substantial, almost a supermajority. And then in 2016, 2018 cycle, you had Republicans face major charges of not even succeeding, trying to repeal Obamacare. If you extend it even further, back in 06, 05, Republicans tried to slightly privatize Social Security, and they got hammered over that issue. So for me personally, I'm kind of a cynic in the ability of any lasting reforms or any positive reforms to be made, because politically it seems like a death sentence to go after. I know that's not the answer people want to hear. That's a major challenge people have to consider, and being how realistic with what their plans are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do agree with your notion that that trying to combat it is really a death sentence, and I think that we're seeing that with the way that politicians are now starting to react. As you mentioned, at the time that the Obamacare proposal got out early on in Obama's first term, you saw a lot of backlash to that across the country, and the Tea Party movement arose essentially directly in response to that. But then in the 2017 to 2018 cycle of Congress, we saw attempts to try to essentially abolish Obamacare, and McCain's very famous vote where he refused to do so, leaving it intact. You saw the opposite trend happening. You saw the opposite reaction from American voters. And now what you're seeing, which is even more interesting, is that numerous Senate candidates in competitive states are trying to defend the record on upholding Obamacare and not trying to tamper with it by any means. And that is a clear reversal from the way that they interacted with Obamacare even just a decade ago. And that's just an interesting, I think that's really just an indication of the current times they're living in. And so, it really just, healthcare policy stands in opposition to whatever the prevailing political force is. And it's because you start to see, opposing parties trying to challenge them. But now we're in the situation where Obamacare is more popular than it was a decade ago. And so it would be, or at least Republican politicians would be remiss to try to tamper with it or mess with it too much.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to give one note here, which is that I think in the other way, Medicare for All could be equally as disastrous as attempt. There have been two attempts to establish a Medicare for All system in the United States. The first was in Vermont, where they actually passed it, and then they were unable to implement it. In fact, the failure of the system is the reason why the 2014 governor race there was so close. It was not a race that was expected to be competitive, and a no-name random Republican almost unseated a Democratic governor that was widely perceived as safe, primarily because of the failure of this issue. And then additionally in Colorado, they attempted to establish it by ballot initiative, and it was rejected 80-20. The voters strongly opposed the concept. So the voter response seems to be overall, don't mess with our healthcare. So if the problem is people don't want their own healthcare messed with, what can you do? Because from the academic perspective, people on both sides of the aisle seem to agree that employer-sponsored healthcare is bad. You ask right-wing economists, left-wing economists, they both agree that it's not an ideal situation. There probably needs to be an adjustment. The question is where it would go. And if you're getting rid of it, ultimately that means people's healthcare will change. They'll have to go to new plans, or they'll have to be shifted somewhere else. So fundamentally, even an issue everyone agrees on, in principle, generally speaking, is one that would be extraordinarily difficult to implement.
Mhm.
I mean, this goes for people like Avik Roy, I know in particular on the Republican side, is a healthcare economist, specifically does not like the concept of employer-sponsored health insurance. There are lots of issues with it. If there was an area of bipartisan support, that could be one of them. But given that the touching healthcare seems to hurt the party in power, there's not a whole lot of incentive to work with the party in power because ultimately your name is going to get plastered on that as well. And that means you could lose your race instead of your opponent losing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you guys provided some interesting debate points. So we're probably going to start wrapping up this episode here. But I think it's nice that you guys had to have another discussion. And I think this was a good episode because we got to go over everything with our ratings. If you don't like the ratings, I'm sorry about that. But please don't think that we're bad people for a rating because honestly, I think that's kind of immature because we did not mean to offend anyone.
Yeah, but I think the majority of people were very respectful. I do know Harrison got some direct messages that were unkind.
No, there was nothing unkind about the direct messages. They're fine. I'm fine with debating people. I don't care if people disagree with the ratings or think they're dumb. I mean, I think that's fine. I'm just saying in general, like, not me. I don't care what people think about me. I'm talking about like just Elections Daily in general. Don't let this make you dislike Elections Daily.
Yeah, I mean, we have people. I mean, we have we take our ratings seriously, and we'll continue to take them seriously. And you can expect to see additional changes and refinements as the election goes on. So, if what people are saying is the case, honestly, and that the race is more of a toss-up, then we'll switch it back to a toss-up. That's ultimately the worst-case scenario here, but we're okay with doing that if that's what it ultimately comes down to.
And at the end of the day, ratings are essentially just educated guessing. You know, there's no definite science behind ratings like there is, for example, behind coronavirus study. But yeah, I think that's enough about ratings for the next forever. Basically, we don't have to worry about ratings for a while. But yeah, I think it's good. So thank you guys for watching tonight. Appreciate it. You have a good night. Always feel free to reach out to me if you disagree with something. I don't. You can curse at me. I don't care. It's fine.
Yeah,
have a good night, guys. Yeah. Thank you so much.